Usually, when we talk about inspecting a building, there is this expectation of, visible structural clarity.
Right, like you can literally see the problem.
Exactly. You look at a skyscraper, you see a crack in the drywall, and the structural engineer just points and says, well, there is your problem. Let's patch the concrete.
It is either broken or not broken. Very clean.
Yeah, it's clean, it is categorized, and it's comforting, honestly, because the threat is quantifiable. But when you step into the world of macro geopolitics or cultural philosophy, that simple inspector's clipboard becomes entirely useless.
Totally useless. You are suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Right. You have to ask yourself, what if the building looks perfectly fine on the outside, like the windows are gleaming, the elevators run, but the inspector tells you the actual foundation, like the invisible subterranean bedrock it was built upon, has completely dissolved.
Which means the structural integrity is just gone, even if the facade remains perfectly intact.
Exactly. And that invisible bedrock is exactly what we are attempting to survey today. We are looking at a deeply philosophical, honestly, incredibly sweeping architectural blueprint of the modern world.
Yeah, today's material is an interview featuring the conservative British commentator and author Melanie Phillips. She was hosted by John Anderson, and the piece is titled Iran, Trump, and the Weakening of the West.
But before we go any further, let's establish the parameters for today's journey, because this is important. We are examining a highly charged, deeply partisan, right-wing political and cultural critique.
Very highly charged.
Yeah, the worldview presented in this text is argued with absolute, just unyielding conviction. So we are putting on our hazmat suits of absolute neutrality today.
Zipping them all the way up.
Right. Our mission is not to take a political side or endorse these viewpoints or, constantly interrupt the logic to fact-check it against competing ideologies. Think of us as neutral tour guides walking you through a very specific, highly provocative museum exhibit.
We are just here to unpack the arguments. We want to figure out how the logic connects from point A to point B within the framework provided by Phillips, and really try to understand the mechanics of this specific worldview.
Because knowledge is most valuable when we can dissect it dispassionately, right? Especially when we are examining perspectives that polarize people.
Absolutely. And the overarching theme threading through this entire interview is the profound argument that the modern West is experiencing a terminal crisis of confidence.
A terminal crisis, wow.
Yeah, the framework presented here suggests that the West has systematically dismantled its own foundational values, its moral scaffolding, basically.
And by doing that, according to the source, it has left itself fatally vulnerable to determined adversaries, both external regimes and internal cultural shifts. It is a staggering claim, because it attempts to tie domestic welfare policy in, say, London or Sydney directly to military strikes in the Middle East.
Right, connecting all of it through this grand theory of psychological decay.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand a philosophical argument that vast, we really cannot start up in the clouds. We have to start on the ground.
Down in the actual geopolitical dirt.
Yeah. The text grounds its entire theory in a massive geopolitical case study, which is the relationship between the United States and Iran. It asks a fundamental question about the limits of having infinite power but zero resolve.
The material launches straight into kinetic, real-world conflict to illustrate this decay. To grasp the author's argument here, you first have to adopt her specific historical timeline.
Right, which starts way before the current headlines.
Exactly. Through Phillips's lens, the Islamic Republic of Iran has not just been in a tense diplomatic standoff with the West. The source argues it has been in an active, declared war with the United States and its allies since the regime's founding revolution in 1979.
Reading that section, the emphasis on 1979 really struck me. She isn't just reciting history for context, she is establishing a legal and moral state of war.
She points directly to the hostage-taking at the U.S. Embassy, the one that basically paralyzed Jimmy Carter's presidency.
Right, and she frames that not as an isolated diplomatic crisis, but as the opening salvo of a war. From her perspective, the hundreds of Americans killed globally and the innumerable attacks on Western interests since that specific year are battles in a continuous war that the West simply refuses to admit it is fighting.
And the worldview we're dissecting posits that for over 4 decades, successive Western administrations across the entire political spectrum, by the way, engaged in this profound, willful denial.
Like they just looked the other way.
Effectively, yes. They left the Iranian regime alone to consolidate its power. The text views the culmination of this denial as the 2015 nuclear deal negotiated under the Obama administration.
Which Phillips characterizes as disastrous.
Very disastrous. The source argues that it didn't prevent a nuclear-armed Iran at all, but rather institutionalized and legitimized a pathway for the regime to eventually acquire that weapon with international blessing.
Which sets the stage for the narrative's major disruptor, which is Donald Trump. The text paints a very specific portrait of Trump's approach here.
It highlights a specific military strike he authorized against Iranian assets as a moment of genuine, singular statesmanship.
And the transcript describes the kinetic reality of this strike really vividly. We are talking about sinking ships, obliterating air defense systems, and eliminating high-ranking leadership.
And the crucial element here, according to the source, is the timeline. Phillips argues this wasn't just some random show of force. She frames it as a last-chance saloon scenario.
The stakes, as outlined in the interview, were existential. The source cites intelligence suggesting Iran was merely weeks away from crossing a nuclear point of no return.
Right, while simultaneously racing to build a ballistic missile arsenal so expansive that it would render the country completely untouchable by conventional means.
So within this specific logical framework, the American military strike was an absolute necessity, and it was conventionally devastating to Iran's capabilities.
It was a massive blow.
I see the logic of the tactical victory there, but it begs a massive question that the text itself wrestles with. If this military strike was so devastating, so effective at crippling their capabilities, why didn't the administration just finish the job?
That is the big question.
Yeah, I mean, if you are Phillips arguing that Iran is literally at war with you, it sounds like the fire department showing up, spraying a high-pressure hose on a blazing house fire, bringing it down to a smolder, and then just packing up the trucks and going home while the embers are still glowing hot. Why retreat when you clearly have the upper hand?
The paradox of that retreat is really central to the text's thesis on Western weakness. According to the interview, Trump faced a localized confluence of immense pressures right at that moment.
Domestic pressures mostly, right?
Yeah, he was staring down a November election. And the American public has this deep, entrenched aversion to protracted foreign wars.
Nobody wants another 20-year conflict.
Exactly. Moreover, Iran didn't respond conventionally to the strike. They responded asymmetrically. The text highlights how they effectively took the Strait of Hormuz hostage.
Oh, right. By threatening that specific vital maritime choke point, they disrupted global shipping and sent oil prices skyrocketing.
Which is absolute political poison for any incumbent president right before an election. Voters feel that immediately at the gas pump.
Precisely the calculation. And the text notes that Israeli intelligence warned the Trump administration that true neutralization of the Iranian threat would actually require supporting the Iranian populace in overthrowing the regime.
Which is a complex, messy process that could easily take a year or more.
But the political reality dictated a 3 to 4 week timeline. So when the regime didn't just collapse instantly, the source argues the administration cut its losses, declared a premature rhetorical victory, and immediately pivoted to seeking negotiations.
And here is where the source's logic really bites down hard. The text points out the absurdity of that pivot. In traditional conflict, if you achieve total victory, you do not negotiate.
No, you dictate the terms of surrender.
Exactly. The moment you ask to negotiate, you are inherently signaling that you lack the capacity or will to force an outcome, which means you are actively giving ground.
This leads to an incredibly fascinating assertion by Phillips about the nature of military might today. How does an Iran that has been conventionally battered still dictate the terms of engagement?
What's fascinating here is the text's total inversion of traditional deterrence theory. Phillips argues that in conventional military metrics, Iran is actually profoundly weak compared to the United States.
Like, not even on the same playing field.
Right. However, they extract an overwhelming, almost paralyzing strength from the psychological weakness of the American political establishment.
It's the idea that owning a garage full of armored Ferraris means absolutely nothing if your opponent knows you are too terrified to ever put the key in the ignition.
That is the exact core mechanism. The source acknowledges America possesses infinitely superior armaments. They could theoretically erase the regime's military infrastructure in a matter of hours.
But infinite power is useless without the political will to deploy it.
Exactly. The text argues that the Iranian regime has shrewdly diagnosed this specific vulnerability. They have correctly deduced that America, terrified of escalation and public backlash, will simply not unleash its full capability.
Which basically grants the regime functional impunity. Deterrence relies entirely on the credibility of the threat, right? If the enemy knows you won't actually strike, the deterrent is zero.
So the mechanics of this game play out in agonizing slow motion. The regime dangles minor, easily reversible concessions. Western negotiators plead for just a little more compromise to avoid conflict, and the cycle of appeasement just continues indefinitely.
It is a chilling diagnosis of geopolitical paralysis. But to understand the root of this, we really have to transition from the hardware of the military to the software of the culture.
The underlying operating system, yeah.
If the West is so overwhelmingly powerful, why is the software so corrupted? Why is the resolve supposedly broken? This requires looking closely at the source's severe critique of the Western psychological mindset.
To understand the why behind this geopolitical paralysis, we must examine the text dissection of what it labels the fatal liberal universalist mindset.
That is a mouthful.
It is. Phillips aims this critique heavily at the European establishment, though she certainly extends it to the American Democratic Party and significant factions of the Republican establishment as well.
There is a quote in the transcript that perfectly encapsulates the mindset Phillips is trying to dismantle here. She describes hearing diplomats and politicians constantly repeat this mantra like, no problem was ever solved by war.
And her response in the text is immediate incredulity. She points directly to the years 1939 to 1945.
The implication is staggering when you think about it. What do these modern diplomats believe stopped the Third Reich? A strongly worded UN resolution and a series of trade embargoes.
The author is highlighting a fundamental structural clash in worldviews. The argument posits that the modern Western elite has been entirely bamboozled by a specific moral doctrine. The belief that the absolute worst outcome in any scenario ever is human casualties. Therefore, the logic dictates war must be avoided at all absolute costs.
Even a just war.
Yes. This includes avoiding a just, decisive war that might actually be strategically necessary to prevent a far greater loss of innocent life in the long run. Because this avoidance is the supreme moral directive, the West defaults to the desperate belief that every single conflict on Earth can be resolved through negotiated compromise.
Because the entire architecture of that liberal universalist mindset relies on a massive hidden assumption, right? That everyone sitting across the diplomatic table is, deep down, a rational actor motivated by economic and political self-interest.
That is the Western assumption, yeah.
Western belief is that if we just sit down, uncover their core grievances, and offer a reasonable compromise, we can shake hands. It's like, sitting down to play chess, and you are adhering strictly to the rules, carefully planning your moves to capture the king.
A completely rational game.
Right. But the person sitting across from you genuinely believes the divine purpose of the game is to pour lighter fluid on the board and set the entire room on fire. And the Western diplomat, completely oblivious to this totally different objective, just keeps offering a draw, completely baffled as to why the opponent keeps reaching for matches.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanical breakdown the text is describing. But Phillips pushes the critique even further.
How so?
The framework presented here doesn't just call this Western mindset naive. It labels it a form of extreme arrogance. She explicitly calls this insistence on projecting Western rationalism onto adversaries a form of cultural colonialism.
Wow, which is a wildly provocative hijacking of that term. I mean, in modern academia, cultural colonialism is almost exclusively used to condemn the West for aggressively imposing its values or economic systems on developing nations.
Yeah, she is flipping the definition entirely. She is suggesting the West is colonizing the world with its own naivety.
The argument is that assuming every single culture shares a baseline desire for peaceful economic coexistence is inherently arrogant.
The text argues that the Iranian regime, for example, is not governed by rational actors seeking a better trade agreement or higher GDP.
No, the source describes the leadership as apocalyptic, messianic religious fanatics who operate under a divine mandate to destroy Israel and America.
So by fundamentally refusing to accept that another culture could operate on a completely different, non-negotiable theological value system, the West displays this fatal blindness.
Treating them like Western diplomats playing a rational game of statecraft just plays directly into their apocalyptic strategy.
And the transcript makes clear that this blindness isn't localized just to the Middle East. It paints a sweeping picture of a deeply fractured, confused West facing a highly unified axis of adversaries.
An axis. We are talking about a coalition involving Iran, China, North Korea, and Russia, according to the text.
Right. And on paper, these nations have wildly different economies, political structures, and regional goals. So what actually binds them together into an axis?
According to the interview, they are bound by one singular unifying characteristic, which is a profound historical loathing of the West.
Coupled with a shared calculated assessment that the West is currently in a state of terminal decadent decay.
The functional cooperation between these nations, as described in the text, is honestly terrifying in its efficiency. Consider the earlier point we talked about, hoping for the Iranian people to overthrow their regime.
Right, the democratic hope.
The source notes that this hope is actively being extinguished by Chinese technology. The transcript details how advanced Chinese surveillance technology, operated by personnel directly trained by Beijing, is basically blanketing Iran.
They're monitoring communications, identifying dissidents, and funneling protesters directly into a judicial system that executes them.
The author points out that this integration of technology and authoritarianism grants these regimes a level of granular, absolute control over their populations that the Soviet KGB could have only dreamt of during the Cold War.
So the diagnostic picture is grim. A technologically advanced, ideologically aligned axis of adversaries is systematically exploiting a Western establishment that structurally refuses to acknowledge the true nature of its enemies.
Which forces us to ask a mechanical question here. How does a society maintain such a massive, supposedly fatal misunderstanding of the world?
It takes effort to be that blind.
Right. If the geopolitical failures are this stark and the stakes are literally existential, how does the delusion persist day after day? To answer that, the text turns its focus away from the politicians and points a glaring spotlight at the information ecosystem.
Specifically the media, the intelligentsia, and the very concept of objective truth itself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the geopolitical disasters are merely symptoms. The text argues that the actual disease resides within the Western mind itself.
A mind that the author claims has been successfully colonized by hostile ideologies.
And the epicenter of this colonization, like the factory floor where this mindset is produced, is the Western university system.
The transcript makes a sweeping foundational assertion right here. It argues that Western universities didn't just recently become politically biased. It claims they fundamentally abolished the concept of objective truth decades ago.
They replaced the rigorous pursuit of factual reality with postmodernism, basically.
Exactly. The idea that everything is subjective, everything is merely a competing narrative constructed by power dynamics.
And therefore, subjective feelings and lived experiences take ultimate precedence over empirical facts.
The mechanism of this decay is vital to understand. The argument posits that once an institution dismantles the framework of objective truth, the entire society loses its intellectual immune system.
Because if there are no hard facts, only competing stories, then the public mind is wide open to manipulation.
Right. The source claims this systemic vulnerability has been recognized and heavily exploited, effectively turning the Western media apparatus into an unwitting but highly effective weapon for those actively trying to dismantle Western civilization.
John Anderson and Melanie Phillips use a very specific, devastating anecdote to illustrate how this media blindness actually functions on the ground. They discuss a period during a protracted conflict when a formalized ceasefire was established in Lebanon.
According to the text, within 4 short hours of that ceasefire taking effect, Hezbollah initiated hostilities by firing missiles into civilian communities in northern Israel.
Just 4 hours. But the critical mechanism of the media failure, according to the source, is what happened next. The British media completely ignored this initial aggressive violation. They simply did not report the missiles being fired at all.
The text argues that the media apparatus only activated its reporting mechanism when Israel, predictably, responded with military airstrikes against the Hezbollah launch sites.
But because the crucial context, the initial unprovoked attack, was deliberately or structurally omitted, the resulting media narrative framed Israel as the unhinged aggressor violating the ceasefire.
The text describes this practice as wicked stuff. It argues that by omitting the causal event, the media becomes an active participant in terrorist propaganda,
completely inverting the reality of the conflict for the domestic audience watching at home on their couches.
Let's pause on that mechanism for a second, because regardless of a listener's political leanings, this is a deeply unsettling concept.
It really is. The text is suggesting that the information ecosystem you rely on to understand reality, like the alerts on your phone, the evening news, might not just carry a slight partisan slant, but might be structurally inverted.
It proposes a world where the entities you are told are aggressive conquerors are actually defending themselves, and the entities framed as marginalized victims are the active instigators.
If you accept this premise, it means millions of citizens are making voting decisions based on a meticulously fabricated reality.
And that profound disorientation leads directly to one of the most powerful and enduring metaphors in the entire transcript. To explain how a society could willingly participate in its own destruction, the source diagnoses the West with a political and cultural autoimmune disease.
Let's delve deeply into this autoimmune metaphor because structurally it explains everything else in the text. In human biology, your immune system is a complex defense network designed to identify and destroy foreign pathogens.
Right, it keeps you alive.
But an autoimmune disease occurs when that system suffers a catastrophic misidentification. It stops recognizing your own healthy, vital organs and begins viciously attacking them.
It treats the body's own tissue as a lethal threat.
The application of this biological failure to microsociety is the absolute core of Phillips' thesis. The text argues that Britain, Europe, and the wider Anglosphere are currently embracing, funding, and protecting the very organisms, hostile ideologies, subversive regimes, radical movements that explicitly state their intention to destroy Western democracy.
Simultaneously, the West directs its cultural and institutional fury inward. It aggressively attacks the traditional values, the defensive institutions, and the historical allies that actually serve to protect it.
It is the tragic spectacle of a civilization turning its own defensive capabilities against its vital organs.
Which brings us neatly back to our initial metaphor of the building inspector.
The inspection clipboard.
We've examined the roof, which are the geopolitical military strikes. We've looked at the windows, which is the inverted media and information systems. Now the source forces us down into the basement, into the foundation itself.
The text argues that this external paralysis and informational blindness don't just manifest out of thin air. They are the inevitable downstream results of a profound rot in domestic, economic, and social structures.
We have to shift from the international battlefield to the internal domestic decay of the West.
This transition leads into a scathing, systemic critique of modern domestic policy. It takes direct aim at the post-World War II social and economic consensus.
The transcript references an Australian journalist who bluntly suggests that the grand social democrat model of governance, basically the welfare state that defined Europe for 70 years, is not just struggling, it is functionally dead.
The math simply no longer works. The source outlines two blunt mechanical reasons for this collapse. First, the demands placed upon the welfare state by the populace grow exponentially and infinitely.
People always want more.
Right. And second, the economic engine, the actual wealth creation required to fund those infinite demands, is stalling and shrinking.
So the state is being crushed from both sides in a vice.
But Phillips doesn't just stop at the economic math. She digs into the psychological conditioning that actually created the math. She identifies what she calls the great lie that political elites have fed the public for generations.
The mechanism of this great lie, as defined by the source, is the pervasive promise that the state exists primarily to provide citizens with whatever they desire, entirely divorced from any expectation of reciprocal responsibility or civic duty.
The text argues that modern Western culture has undergone a disastrous conflation. It has completely erased the boundary between fundamental needs and infinite wants.
We all learn this basic distinction in elementary economics, right? A need is biological: food, clean water, basic shelter from the elements.
Exactly. A want is a luxury.
Yeah.
A new smartphone, a larger television, or abstractly, a perfectly comfortable, friction-free life where you are never offended.
But the source argues that the evolution of modern human rights culture has essentially categorized every subjective demand, every single want, as an unassailable human right that the government is legally and morally obligated to fulfill.
Which creates a hyper-individualistic society whose sole operating principle is basically what matters is me, my feelings, what I demand, and absolutely nobody has the authority to tell me no.
Building on that hyper-individualism, the text argues this shift catalyzed a catastrophic change in how Western society manages success and failure.
The source asserts that Britain and the broader West made a conscious, deliberate decision to dismantle the concept of meritocracy.
Meritocracy being the fundamental engine of the 20th century. The idea that individuals rise in society based on their competence, their effort, and their talent.
But the harsh reality of meritocracy, however, is that it guarantees inequality of outcome. If you reward merit, some people will inevitably succeed wildly and others will fail.
And that inherent potential for failure is exactly what the text claims modern society found completely intolerable. The cultural elite decided it was simply too cruel for anyone to experience the sting of failure.
The prevailing psychological theory became that facing insurmountable obstacles or failing a test would irrevocably damage a person's self-esteem.
Consequently, the societal objective shifted drastically. The goal was no longer equality of opportunity, which means ensuring everyone has a fair start at the beginning of the race.
Right. The new mandate became equity, which the source strictly defines as enforcing an equality of outcome at the finish line, regardless of the effort, talent, or behavior exhibited during the race.
I think we need a better mechanical analogy to really understand the economic and cultural impact of replacing equality of opportunity with mandated equity.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine society as a complex, highly engineered gearbox inside a massive engine. In a meritocracy, you recognize that gears are different sizes and spin at different speeds to create torque.
That's equality of opportunity, letting the gears do what they are best at.
Exactly. Equity, according to this critique, is like a mechanic, deciding it is fundamentally unfair that the gears spin at different speeds. So he welds them all together, demanding every single gear, regardless of size, turn at the exact same RPM.
Oh man, what happens?
The engine doesn't become fairer. It literally tears itself apart under the strain, and all forward momentum stops. To achieve equal outcomes, you cannot magically elevate the lowest performer to genius level. You must forcefully constrain the high performers. You level the entire society down.
That engine analogy perfectly captures the systemic friction the source is describing. Furthermore, the text argues that this well-intentioned attempt to protect citizens from the friction of failure has resulted in a massive psychological backfire.
By systematically removing obstacles, and thereby robbing individuals of the necessity to work hard, adapt, and overcome adversity, the state hasn't engineered a utopia of secure, well-adjusted citizens at all.
No, instead, the text points to a reality of unprecedented skyrocketing levels of mental illness, clinical depression, and profound aimlessness among the younger generation.
The source argues that this generation feels unwanted, unloved, and fundamentally unworthy.
Why? Because true self-worth cannot be handed out by a government program. It is forged only through the process of facing a challenge, potentially failing, and eventually overcoming it.
By removing the challenge, you hollow out the individual, creating a cascading moral collapse that strips citizens of their agency entirely.
Which loops directly back to the geopolitical and domestic political crises we discussed earlier. The state promised a friction-free existence, promising it could provide infinite resources and equal outcomes.
But when the mathematical reality hit, and the state inevitably failed to deliver on that impossible utopian promise, the public's trust in the institutions of representative democracy simply evaporated.
The text views the current global surge of dangerous political populism, citizens willing to vote to burn the entire system down or hand-sweeping power to autocrats, as the direct logical consequence of this broken social contract.
The political elites sold a utopian lie. The populace realized they were being lied to, and now a profound destructive cynicism has taken root where trust used to be.
So if we look at the diagnostic chart so far, we have a society crippled by an autoimmune disease, economically stretched to the breaking point by infinite welfare demands, psychologically fragile from a lack of meritocratic challenge, and utterly devoid of institutional trust.
It's a bleak picture.
Very. The next crucial question is, how does this internal theoretical vacuum of values actually ignite real-world cultural conflict? Where does this friction spark a literal fire?
To see that, the text directs us to examine the foundational legal system, specifically focusing on the shifting legal landscape of Britain, framing it as the ultimate domestic clash of civilizations.
The foundation of this argument relies on a deep, almost sacred reverence for the historical mechanism of British freedom, which is common law.
Common law is fundamentally a system of negative liberty. It operates on the core principle that everything is inherently permissible for a citizen unless a specific law explicitly forbids it.
It isn't a top-down list of rules generated by a bureaucracy. It is an organic system built over centuries through the experience of everyday life, mediated slowly through the courts as disputes actually arise.
The text argues that this common law system was the great cultural unifier. It applied equally to everyone, bringing a diverse country under a single adaptable standard.
But the source claims the British political and legal elite willfully abandoned this organic system in favor of adopting a European-style rights culture, which is heavily influenced by the Napoleonic Code.
In this new system, the presumption flips entirely. Nothing is truly secure or permitted unless it is explicitly written down and granted by the state as a right.
And as we discussed regarding the welfare state, this rights culture fractured the unified society into warring, tribal factions, each aggressively lobbying the state for a bigger slice of the legal and economic pie.
This systemic fracturing sets the stage for what the source views as the ultimate existential threat to Western domestic cohesion, which is the establishment and toleration of Sharia law within the borders of Britain.
The host, John Anderson, introduces a specific, highly controversial metric to ground this point. He states he has been informed there are upwards of 85 Sharia law courts operating currently within the country, operating completely outside the bounds of British common law.
And Phillips does not merely agree this is a problem, she categorizes it as a fatal breach of the Hall. She views the presence and operation of Sharia law in Britain not as a demonstration of multicultural tolerance, but as a direct, aggressive onslaught against the absolute, non-negotiable core value of Western democratic society, which she defines simply as one law for all.
Her logic is pretty brutal here. The moment you permit different legal codes for different demographic groups, you cease to be a unified society. You degrade into a collection of competing tribes merely occupying the same geographical space.
But the text recognizes the immediate logical counterargument this raises, and it explicitly addresses it.
Right. A critic of Phillips might immediately ask, wait a minute, don't Orthodox Jewish communities in Britain and America also operate their own religious courts?
Exactly. Why is the source framing Sharia courts as an apocalyptic threat while remaining perfectly comfortable with the existence of Jewish religious courts?
As someone listening to this argument unfold, that is the first massive pothole in the logic I would point out. If religious legal structures are the problem, why target just one? But the worldview we are dissecting here explicitly unpacks this distinction, and the entire argument hinges on the mechanical concepts of legal hierarchy and ultimate sovereignty.
According to the framework provided by Phillips, Jewish religious courts, which primarily deal with internal communal matters like marriage, divorce, and dietary laws, operate strictly and voluntarily under the umbrella of British secular law.
So they aren't trying to supersede it.
Right. For example, a Jewish marriage or divorce conducted in Britain must fully incorporate and satisfy all the legal requirements of British civil law to actually be recognized. The religious court functions somewhat like a localized administrative tribunal regulating religious life, but it operates entirely within the boundaries and final authority set by the secular state.
The source emphasizes that the cardinal, historical principle for diaspora Jews is that the law of the land is the supreme law.
The text argues that Sharia law, however, operates on a fundamentally incompatible philosophical and theological premise. The source asserts that traditional Islamic jurisprudence does not and cannot accept that any human secular law is superior to Sharia.
Why not?
Because Sharia is viewed not as a human construct, but as the immutable, perfect word of God. Therefore, the argument goes, Sharia courts do not view themselves as operating under the umbrella of British law. They view themselves as a parallel legal system, or theologically, as the ultimate authority above secular law.
In this framing, a citizen is never truly underneath the law of the land. Their ultimate binding loyalty is to Sharia.
And this theological distinction is exactly why the source concludes that Sharia is inherently subversive to the mechanics of a secular democracy. It is a direct negation of the foundational principle of one law for all.
However, the text highlights a secondary, deeply troubling phenomenon surrounding this dynamic. The source asserts that discussing this structural incompatibility is practically forbidden in polite society or mainstream political discourse.
The text claims you will not find a mainstream politician with the courage to seriously discuss regulating or banning these courts. And the text points right back to that autoimmune weakness to explain why.
Politicians are paralyzed by a dual fear. First, there is the literal physical fear of violence, the chilling effect of knowing that speaking out against radical ideologies can result in assassination or terrorism.
Which is a very real deterrent.
It is. Second, and perhaps more pervasive, is the intense social and professional fear of being branded a racist or an Islamophobe by the media and cultural elite.
Consequently, the society completely silences itself, aggressively punishing anyone who points out that its foundational legal principle is allegedly being dismantled from within.
It is essential to reiterate here that this is the specific, highly charged, and deeply controversial viewpoint of the speaker in the text. We are just charting the map.
Absolutely. But if you follow the internal logic of the source's argument, this terrified silence is the ultimate undeniable proof that the West has lost the moral conviction to defend its own core values.
And this pervasive cultural autoimmune disease, this inability to define or defend truth, has allowed an even more specific, devastating ideological Trojan horse to breach the gates of the West, one that the text argues is currently wreaking havoc on Jewish citizens globally.
This brings us to what is undoubtedly the most emotionally raw, intensely debated, and historically charged section of the entire transcript.
Without a doubt.
The source posits that because the West systematically abolished objective truth in its universities, and because it lost its moral compass, it became highly susceptible to narratives specifically engineered to destroy it. This leads to Phillips's searing, uncompromising critique of what she terms Palestinianism.
The source makes a sweeping, highly controversial claim regarding the nature of this geopolitical movement. Phillips argues that the Palestinian cause, as it is widely championed and understood by activists in the West, is not fundamentally a movement about securing human rights.
Nor is it a standard territorial dispute over borders, according to her.
Right. She asserts it functions as an ideological Trojan horse. She claims the prevailing narrative of stolen land and indigenous displacement is a complete lie, constructed with a very specific, malevolent objective to systematically strip away and steal Jewish historic identity and delegitimize the existence of a Jewish state.
To explain how this narrative gains such incredible traction, she traces the rhetoric of the modern movement, arguing that it does not originate from modern human rights law at all.
Where does it come from, then?
She argues it draws its power directly from deeply ingrained medieval Christian anti-Semitic tropes, evoking imagery similar to the Inquisition, combined with the highly effective propaganda techniques developed by the Soviet Union.
The text argues these ancient hatreds have been cleverly repackaged and rebranded to perfectly masquerade as a righteous, intersectional cause of the oppressed.
Because the West is desperate for moral causes to replace the religion it abandoned, she argues this fabricated narrative has seamlessly become synonymous with conscience itself.
Which means that millions of genuinely well-meaning, compassionate people in the West have unwittingly aligned themselves with a movement that, in her view, ultimately demands the extermination of the Jewish homeland and the complete erasure of Judaism.
The text frames this widespread acceptance as the terminal stage of the West's moral decay. When a civilization's premier institutions, its universities and media, abolish the concept of objective truth, it creates an environment where, as the source vividly states, murderous lies stand for conscience.
The argument is that the moral compass hasn't just lost its north. The magnet has been entirely reversed. What is currently celebrated as high moral conscience in the streets of Western capitals is, according to this framework, actually acting in the service of profound historical evil.
And the human toll of this ideological inversion, as described in the transcript, is visceral and devastating. The text doesn't just talk about abstract geopolitics. It highlights the terrifying daily reality for diaspora Jews, citizens living their normal lives in places like Australia, Britain, America, and Canada.
The source describes these communities as feeling totally gaslighted, completely besieged in the countries they call home. And bizarrely, they are held personally, morally responsible for the perceived military actions of Israel.
There is a horrifying anecdote in the text about an individual simply going about their day in a Western city and being aggressively confronted by a stranger demanding, "Why are you killing babies?"
It represents a level of societal derangement and collective guilt that leaves average citizens bewildered, isolated, and frankly terrified for their safety.
Recognizing this acute crisis, the source transitions from grand diagnosis to granular practical survival tactics. Phillips discusses her book, Fighting the Hate, which she explicitly frames as a tactical handbook for Jews and their allies who find themselves under siege in this hostile cultural environment.
It offers specific, honestly counterintuitive advice for individuals facing this overwhelming onslaught of gaslighting and public defamation.
I found the tactical advice in this section fascinating because it functions almost like intellectual judo. It is martial arts designed for a poisoned debate arena.
The foundational principle she advocates is, do not meet brute, irrational force with brute, logical force. When someone aggressively confronts you with a preposterous, deeply offensive, or historically illiterate claim, your base human instinct is overwhelming rage.
Of course it is. You want to yell, "How dare you?" That is the complete fabrication. Let me outline the last 3,000 years of history to prove you wrong, right here on the sidewalk.
But the source explicitly and emphatically advises against giving in to that instinct. Phillips argues that you must park the rage.
If you attempt to engage in a debate over vast, incredibly complex moral landscapes, for instance, trying to logically convince a screaming, hostile activist that the IDF operates a highly moral army with strict rules of engagement, you will automatically lose.
Why? Because you allow yourself to be sucked into a defensive posture entirely dictated by their hostile terms. It's the classic trap of answering the question, when did you stop beating your wife?
The very act of engaging with the premise validates the accusation and condemns you.
Exactly. You cannot win a debate when the opponent has rigged the definitions of the words you are using. Instead, her recommended tactic is incredibly focused. Use a single, undeniable historical fact, deploy a piercing, logical question that exposes a contradiction in their narrative, or even utilize a disarming joke.
The objective of this tactic is not to win a grand sweeping debate, nor is it to miraculously convert a hostile activist into a Zionist on the street corner.
The goal is much more modest and strategic. It is simply to pry open a sealed mine, just a microscopic crack, planting a single seed of cognitive dissonance.
And crucially, the source offers a piece of advice here that requires immense, almost superhuman grace under fire. Phillips reminds her readers that to effectively engage, they must deeply respect the reality that many of the protesters and activists confronting them are not at their core inherently evil or malicious individuals.
That is such a vital distinction to make. She acknowledges that many of the people marching or posting online are driven by genuinely noble, deeply compassionate sentiments.
They possess a real desire for justice. They are motivated by a sincere wish to protect those they perceive as oppressed.
The tragedy, according to the framework of the text, is not that these people are evil, but that their good intentions and their compassion have been systematically hijacked and harnessed by a fabricated, malevolent, and highly sophisticated narrative.
Recognizing that the person screaming at you might actually genuinely believe they are the hero of the story fundamentally alters how you must engage with them. It shifts the tactic from trying to defeat an enemy to trying to break a spell.
So if we pull back and look at the massive diagnostic chart we have constructed today, we have mapped out the source's entire exhaustive diagnosis of the Western condition.
We've explored the paralysis of geopolitical military weakness, the structural blindness of the information and media ecosystem, the devastating economic and psychological collapse brought on by the welfare state and equity culture, the subversive legal fracturing via parallel courts, and the profound moral inversion represented by the acceptance of ideological Trojan horses.
We are staring at a blueprint of a society that, in the source's view, has completely, utterly lost its way and is nearing structural collapse. This demands we address the final, critical question posed by the text. What is the cure?
If the building is falling down, how does the West rebuild the scaffolding?
Because you simply cannot write a critique this sweeping, point out all the pervasive rot in the foundation, and then just drop the microphone and walk away. The author has to offer a mechanism for salvation.
And to clear the ground for her solution, the text must first completely demolish the solution that the majority of the modern secular West currently relies upon to maintain order. And that target is the prevailing myth of secular humanism.
The transcript features a fascinating exchange between the host, John Anderson, and an Australian academic regarding this exact point, concluding that modern secular humanism is proving completely, disastrously inadequate to the task of maintaining a cohesive, moral society.
The source entirely rejects the comforting modern notion that values such as universal human dignity, compassion for the weak, and adherence to the rule of law are simply evolutionary traits coded in our DNA as human beings.
Phillips is incredibly blunt here. She essentially calls anyone who believes morality is just innate biology profoundly ignorant of history. She also aggressively pushes back against the popular secular narrative that Western civilization inherited all its enlightened goodness and democratic values directly from the ancient Greeks, bypassing religion entirely.
She points out the stark historical reality. By modern human rights standards, the ancient Greeks were an incredibly brutal, cruel, and heartless society.
They absolutely did not believe in universal human dignity. They relied heavily on slavery. They practiced infanticide, and they maintained a violently stratified society where the strong rightfully dominated the weak.
Having dismissed biology and the Greeks, the source arrives at its final, grand, overarching thesis. Phillips asserts with absolute conviction that all the defining greatness of Western civilization its unique moral compass, its drive for scientific modernity, its invention of true political freedom, and above all, the radical, world-changing concept that every single individual possesses inherent, unalienable dignity because they are created in the image of a creator. All of it stems exclusively from one specific historical source.
The Hebrew Bible, as mediated and spread globally through the infrastructure of Christianity.
And this brings us back to the ultimate defining metaphor of our deep dive, the concept of the scaffolding.
If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, religion, according to the mechanics of this text, is not merely a private spiritual hobby. It is the essential, load-bearing scaffolding of any enduring culture.
It provides the absolute moral parameters and the unified political framework that holds the immense weight of a society up.
The text notes that the Islamic world, for all its differences with the West, understands this structural reality perfectly. They do not separate their theology from their societal structure.
But the West, in its modern arrogance, decided that religion was a backward, authoritarian, anachronistic relic of a less enlightened age.
So the intellectual and political elites of the West essentially took a massive wrecking ball to their own civilizational identity. They systematically knocked down the Judeo-Christian scaffolding that took millennia to build, the very structure that allowed their civilization to rise and flourish.
And now, as they stand bewildered in the rubble, watching their geopolitical deterrence falter in the Middle East, watching their domestic trust evaporate into populism, and watching their unified legal systems fracture into tribalism, they are completely confused as to why the building is collapsing around their ears.
The text concludes with a stark, uncompromising ultimatum. The argument posits that it is structurally and historically impossible for the West to survive as the West unless it actively reinstitutes its foundational infrastructure.
The only viable cure for what Phillips diagnoses as the West's mortal sickness is a conscious societal return to its roots.
It demands that the West re-acknowledge and re-embrace Judeo-Christianity not just as a historical footnote, but as the active, fundamental scaffolding of its civilization.
Wow. Take a breath, because that is an absolutely massive, intense intellectual journey we just went on.
From analyzing the tactical decision-making of Donald Trump launching military strikes in the Middle East, all the way to a grand philosophical demand to resurrect the Judeo-Christian theological foundation of Western civilization.
We have explored the complex mechanics of asymmetrical warfare and deterrence. We've broken down the chilling concept of a structurally inverted media ecosystem. We've analyzed the psychological and economic damage wrought by replacing meritocracy with mandated equity. And we've navigated the intense, volatile cultural friction surrounding parallel legal systems and the weaponization of historical narratives.
It is a breathtakingly comprehensive, highly interconnected, and deeply controversial worldview. It attempts to explain nearly every facet of modern anxiety, from the epidemic of youth depression to the complexities of global terrorism, through a single unifying lens.
The disastrous cultural and moral abandonment of the West's foundational principles.
And to you, our listener, joining us on this deep dive. Whether you found yourself vigorously nodding along in agreement as we unpacked this text, feeling like someone finally articulated your concerns, or whether you were vehemently disagreeing, pacing your kitchen, and yelling counter-arguments at your speakers for the last hour, this exploration proves one thing absolutely.
The world is not compartmentalized.
Geopolitics in the Strait of Hormuz, domestic welfare policy in London, the curriculum taught in a Sydney university, and the foundational ancient myths of a culture are all deeply, inextricably intertwined.
You cannot pull on a military thread in the Middle East without eventually unraveling a debate about the nature of truth in the legal system in your own hometown.
This deep dive challenges all of us to stop looking just at the drywall and ask ourselves, what do we believe is the fundamental load-bearing scaffolding of our own society? What is the bedrock that holds it all up?
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought, an extrapolation that extends beyond the boundaries of the text itself. The worldview we explored today argues with absolute historical certainty that a society's survival depends entirely on a unified, religious foundational myth, a single massive piece of historical scaffolding.
But we live in a hyper-globalized, deeply pluralistic, technologically interconnected 21st century.
The demographics of the West today are fundamentally different than they were a century ago.
Exactly. So the challenge is this. Is it actually mechanically possible for a highly interconnected, modern, incredibly diverse democracy to ever successfully return to a single, exclusive religious scaffolding without fracturing completely into those warring tribal factions the text so deeply fears?
Or is the ultimate unprecedented existential challenge of our era not to desperately try and rebuild the old framework, but to invent an entirely new type of structural engineering.
Can we forge a new scaffolding, one that can hold up a diverse, multicultural society, maintaining a shared moral reality and objective truth without relying on a shared, exclusive theology?
That might just be the defining question of the next century.
And as we leave you to ponder whether the foundation of our global house can be patched with the old mortar, or if the entire concept of the foundation needs to be radically reimagined, I want to thank you for joining us on this intense intellectual exploration. Keep questioning the narratives around you, keep looking closely at the invisible bedrock beneath your feet, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.